Good morning, everyone. My name is Kim Maybon. I am the board chair for the Corona Chamber of Commerce and owner of Creative by Design. We have a great day today with some important updates ahead, and we appreciate you taking your time to join us. As all our weekly calls are informative, we continue to assist you in creating vision and bring a variety of speakers and topics. Today's event is sponsored by Altura Credit Union. Altura is a community-based credit union here to successfully serve its members with all of their financial goals. Altura's board members are local leaders who volunteer their time and are deeply committed to the community. Unlike a corporate bank, they understand the differentiating needs of the everyday individual. Wow, I'm stumbling today. Thank you, Altura, for sponsoring this meeting. As a reminder, please use the chat button to ask any questions. Send your questions to the chamber host, and we will verbally ask them at the appropriate time. Next Tuesday, September 21st, in partnership with the City and Inland Empire PTAC, we will be hosting a free virtual government contracting seminar. This seminar will cover the basics of government contracting and will allow you to see if your capabilities before pursuing government contracts. Register now at the bit.ly shown on the screen. Coming later this month, in just over 2 weeks, is our 10th annual Women's Leadership Conference. This will be held in person at Crossroads Church with doors opening at 7:15 a.m. A virtual option is also available. We invite you to come out and listen as we have 10-minute talks from some of the most impactful women in the area. We will also have a physicians panel and a special message from founder of the conference, Supervisor Karen Spiegel. Get your tickets today at mychamber.org/WLC. Our next mixer will be held on October 5th at Sunset Vans here in Corona from 5 to 7 p.m. We will be featuring a very amazing guest, founder and CEO of Destroy Duchenne, Elijah Stacy, who will be signing copies of his new book. This is a mixer and you do not want to miss it. Sign up today at the bit.ly shown on the screen. If you are a guest with us today and not currently a member of the Corona Chamber, we welcome you to join our chamber family. Meetings like this are just one of the many benefits to being part of an active, thriving organization like the Corona Chamber. Please outreach to Robert Yanez so he can review the many incentives for both joining and referring a business to join. Before we begin with our next segment, I'd like to share with you who is on the call. We have former City Council member Yolanda Carrillo and Norco College President Dr. Monica Green. Thank you very much for joining us today. At this time, we will shift to our advocacy segment where our legislative advocate, Jeff Gibson, will share. Keeping a pulse on what's happening in Sacramento and Washington, D.C. can be a full-time job. With Jeff Gibson's thorough and complete research, he helps the Corona Chamber to act timely on projects and initiatives that help make a difference in shaping our community. As owner of Occidental Communications Group, his knowledge of complex political issues and the great relationships he has built ensure the Corona Chamber has all the tools to be effective on behalf of the business community. Please help me welcome Jeff Gibson to share a legislative update.
Thank you, Kim. I appreciate that. So obviously we've had a number of items in the news over this last week and wanted to share each of those with you. We have one slide here that kind of will go into several different areas, many of them underreported, that deal with things that are going to have impact on your business, very likely over the next quarter, that are in what we would call the public policy realm. So looking at this, the major news. So some of this is starting to get out if you watch CNBC or Fox Business or read the Wall Street Journal a little bit or some web sources. But the Chinese real estate market is going through a major meltdown, much, much larger than what we went through in America in 2007. Now, the advantages we had in 2007 and 8, and then in the recession that each of us lived through as employers between 2007 and 2010, are that we lived in a country that has the world's reserve currency, so that we had the ability to actually price our problem per se, or we could access debt by printing money. 2, we had the world's largest economy and the world's largest credit line. much, much larger than the actual crisis itself, so that we could dig ourselves out of a hole and then earn ourselves out of a hole. The challenge that is in China right now is that their problem is 3 to 4 times more acute than what happened in the United States. The second problem, so right now, just in just 1 week, basically since the start of the month of September, they've lost over $1 trillion. Their 2 largest funds have melted down. And for investors, they can no longer claim any investment that they have in Chinese real estate as collateral for loans. So now what happens are hedge funds, which are the main organizations that buy commercial paper loans. Obviously, we've talked about this before, and you've lived through it. And you've seen might have seen the movie Big Short that explains a lot of this. But when you take a loan, the loan is purchased by a long-term investor based upon your credit worthiness. Well, those organizations themselves rely on their own credit worthiness, which is the number of assets that they have on their books that they indeed can use as collateral for other loans. So if we were all running one of these types of funds, we wouldn't want a single asset on our books that we could not claim as collateral, because then we would have to go through and explain why it wasn't credit worthy per se. Well, now in the United States and around the globe, if you want access to any global financial market, you cannot claim Chinese real estate or any investment in the Chinese economy that has a connection to real estate as collateral for your company. So what that means in the United States, there are a lot of companies that don't have any connection to real estate. Creative by Design, for instance, does not have on its books a large, or maybe Kim does, because this is, she's a successful and wonderful person, has a large holding of real estate. But in the United States, we have a number of different types of, endless types of companies that may or may not have access. In China, over 45% of a company is controlled by the Chinese government. And so what you have are interlocking ownership, which you had in the Japanese economy in the early 90s. If you remember the late 80s, what you had is in Japan, there was a discussion that the Japanese economy would be much larger than the United States economy about this time in history. Unfortunately, they had a credit crisis. And when you had interlocking relationships that went all the way into the Japanese government, when times were good, it was great. It was an incredible advantage. When times were bad, then everything fell together. And that's the problem that China's facing. The reason it matters to us here today is that there are a number of American investors that are going to be taking substantial losses. Those American investors are also very deeply integrated into the American debt markets. So, for everybody here on the call that relies on some form of short-term or long-term leverage or loans to operate their, for operational purposes, that's probably going to be showing up there. Now, the advantage for us is we are, again, the world's safe haven. So you're going to be having people, both foreign and domestic, who were previously invested in the Chinese market, that are going to have this money available. And they're going to be looking for things like American real estate. They're going to be looking for things like American commercial debt. And that's going to be a great advantage to us. So you're going to have some disadvantage. You're going to have here are some dislocations. And we're here to let you know that those things are coming. It's not an easy story to always disentangle, and so it's not going to make it very widely into the marketplace. But if you want to follow it, the biggest portion of this, in fact, there was a major riot yesterday in Shanghai over this. It's called Evergrande, Evergrande is the name of the company. It was a $300 billion company. and it is now heading into bankruptcy very quickly. So on September 1st, it was worth $300 billion. Today, it's heading into bankruptcy. So these are, these are trying times we're living in, and they're hitting all over the globe. And sometimes that hits us back here in Corona as well. So moving on, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have about that.
Anthony?
We do have one question. Will the real estate meltdown impact the residential home market?
Typically, both in 1997 and then again in the so in the 1990 meltdown of Japanese debt, California real estate larger California real estate projects went through a short bump down and then a large bump up. And the bump down was when Japanese companies that were highly invested in California real estate, both commercial projects and real estate, in residential real estate, had to get their capital back to pay off their domestic debts. So in some markets in California, in some real estate markets where the Chinese have been very active, one of those was the Platinum Triangle in Anaheim. Recently, one of the funds that is now bankrupt spent a huge amount of money entitling a gigantic project across the street from Anaheim Stadium, which they successfully entitled. And at the time, they were talking about building it completely for cash, which was into the hundreds of millions of dollars. And Anaheim was popping corks and couldn't be more excited. Well, that sold for pennies on the dollar because they needed that money back earlier in the COVID crisis. So you had a short dip down, and then people who had been investing in Japan were looking for safe havens. Then you resumed the upward momentum of prices in California at the time. That was in 1990. You had the same type of thing in 1997 with the Asian foreign currency meltdown, which China was a big part of at that point. It's one of the reasons why China pulled its currency off of foreign currency markets and actually fixes the amount of what their currency is worth. And so, yeah, there's going to be a little bit of a you'll see you might see that show up in real estate prices in the immediate future of having some downward pressure. But over the between now and we're heading into a typically slower era of the year, region of the year for residential real estate transactions. Usually the last 2 quarters are not very strong, but resuming in the middle of quarter 1. So quarter 1, quarter 2, early part of quarter 3 are good for residential real estate. And then the rest of the year is kind of once kids get back in school, it gets a little bit tougher for real estate in California. But I don't know if that answers your question or if there was another one, Anthony.
I do believe that answered it, and I think you can continue.
All right. So moving on to national vaccine mandates. So again, we're trying to leave we are 4 levels below the political in the work that we do. We're really into what's going to impact your business starting tomorrow to the best effect that we can. Obviously, politics drive a lot of the policy discussion, and we're very honest about that. But getting into the national vaccine mandate discussion of the president last week on Thursday had some major announcements on who would be mandated to take vaccines and how that would play out. The most of that policy is based on a 1905 Supreme Court decision that was reaffirmed in 1922. So this is before the right to privacy was created. This is before a number of the individual rights of people, all of the anti-discrimination codes, all of those other what would be considered follow along court precedents, which are much, much more substantial in American life. Before those were put into place, there was a 1905 Supreme Court decision that a state could compel an individual to receive the smallpox vaccination or face a $5 fine. This is also the court that ruled that people could be sterilized based upon IQ tests. So it was a little out of step with where we are today as a society, and it's more than likely to come up in court precedent. So what the president ordered basically was, if you have any sort of financial tie to the federal government, if you are a vendor of the federal government, if you're a government agency that takes federal money, so you could be looking at schools, you could be looking at colleges, you could be looking at a number of locations. The executive order was not specific to those, but as we know, it's not just the order, it's the regulations that follow along with the order, and that there's a much larger process. The regulatory process for enacting executive orders is very long. It is not designed for emergencies per se, which is why up until the last 4 administrations, executive orders were fairly regularly avoided, because it takes 2 to 3 years for regulations coming out of a code to be fully vetted and then go through the process. We want, as individuals who want to interact with our government, you want a long regulatory process, because that gives you the ability to sit and influence and say, okay, the legislature said it was this, the president or governor or executive says it's this. In reality, it's this. So how do we get their policy goal into what is reality? That's the regulatory process that you want, whether you're on the left or the right, because then you have a regulation that is actually useful in the marketplace. So that said, it's very difficult, as we've also always seen since March of 2020, for any executive, whether it's a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, whatever party, to successfully implement an executive order on a moment's notice. So there's a lot of issues that come out of that. The precedent that they're based on is extremely narrow. It does not get into the idea of the federal government issuing a regulation on this topic that can be used. The president has proposed that OSHA in the next 100 days is going to come up with a set of rules for employers over 100 people. But there are intervening events that have come about since then, including emerging science that vaccination mandates won't affect the rate of people getting vaccinations. One of the examples, of course, is in England or Great Britain, which is now going to be scrapping their vaccination passport policy. I'm only describing that because these are the types of organizations that the United States relies on to figure out if their policy is going to be effective. So we are tracking that closely, that we are within the 100-day window of OSHA putting out its rules on what a mandate would look like for employers, what standards would follow, what medical requirements would fall on employers and others. So happy to answer your questions to the best of my ability, and then we'll definitely keep you up to date on that. Do you have any questions?
There are no questions, Jeff, so you can continue.
All right, stunned them into silence on the national vaccine mandates. So, and then on to the state issues. So obviously many of you have probably seen the results or Currently, the statewide recall is failing by a 2/3 to 1/3 margin. There are not enough outstanding votes. There's not any sort of trend that would indicate that there's going to be there's going to be any sort of change in the policy per se, or change in the election. So clearly the governor is back at work today. He's signing legislation. I checked on several of the pieces of legislation that we've been tracking. SB 9, which allows for additional units to be built to be the basis for lot line splits in single family residential neighborhoods, which we talked about. SB 10, which allows for the building of medium density, smaller apartment type projects in areas that would typically be considered to be commercial zones, and a number of the pieces of legislation that passed have been sent to the governor. The governor has not signed any of those pieces of legislation yet. He has until October 10th to do that, and we will be tracking that very closely as well. But happy to discuss any of those or whatever questions that you may have.
There are currently no questions, Jeff, so thank you very much.
All right. I will be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. You can always reach out to your local representatives, Assemblymember Sabrina Cervantes and Senator Richard Roth, both of whose contact information is on your screen. We'd also like to thank Representative Brad West from Assemblymember Sabrina Cervantes for being on the call, as well as our chair for legislative outreach, Jeff Miller, who's a former state assembly member, former Corona mayor, and a successful business owner. Thank you, Jeff. We'd once again like to thank today's sponsor, Altura Credit Union. They provide accurate, consistent, and personalized service with every interaction, every time. Learn more at alturacu.com. If you'd like to sponsor a future business briefing, please contact the Chamber. Register now to join us next Wednesday, September 15th. Actually, that's today. So next Wednesday, the 22nd, for more advocacy news. Thank you everyone for attending. Our meeting is adjourned.